Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last session of this Learn Together event, the best session of the Learn Together event. They always save the best for last, or at least that's what they told us. This session is called Enhancing Your Development, Collaboration, and Productivity. That was the session title they gave us, but we rewrote it to Write Anywhere, Run Anywhere. My name is Burke, and I work with the VS Code team on Microsoft, and this is my colleague, Brigit. Hey, Brigit.
Hey, Burke. Yeah, my name is Brigit, and I'm a program manager on the Visual Studio Code team. And today, Burke and I are going to show you how you can truly write your code anywhere and run it anywhere, depending on your preferences. So if we go over to the next slide, it might look a little bit familiar for your current workflow today. So you might start off with some source code in GitHub, and then you might clone it locally using your terminal, and then you go ahead and work on it in your favorite editor, so let's say VS Code, and then you make some changes, you're coding, and then you want to bring those changes into GitHub, you push, you do commits, you open the terminal again, you're back in the browser, and you have to do some context switching, and the cycle continues. That's why we have all these awesome arrows. So we stopped and we thought, what if we could eliminate some of these extra context and switching? And what if we could just bring this process down to Visual Studio Code and GitHub or a web browser? Or even better than that, what if we could just use Visual Studio Code? Or what if we could just use a web browser and we didn't even have to install anything on our local machines? This is actually possible today. So we're going to hop over to some demos and show you how it's possible. So Burke, over to you.
Awesome. Let's get into it. All right. So this is the application that they've been working on all day, and we're going to work on it too. Same application. Now, normally what we would do here, as Brigit was describing, is we come and go to code and copy this here, then come back to the terminal, clone it. Well, we're actually not going to do any of that. So let me jump over to Visual Studio Code. And the first thing that we want to do is just open this project, but I don't want to actually clone it. I just want to open it. I shouldn't have to clone it to look at it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is click down here in the left-hand corner. I'm going to go down to, let's see, Open GitHub repository here. And you can see that it's already pasted in for me the repo to open. But if I back up, I can just say Open a repository from GitHub, and I can actually type my repo name or my account name, and then you can see the repos right there. So let's see, the Learn Together Brainstorm app, and I'm going to select that. Visual Studio Code's going to reload, and what you're going to see is that this project is loaded in Visual Studio Code, but it's not actually cloned. I didn't clone anything. I just opened it. And the reason why that's possible is because of an extension called the GitHub repositories extension. It's always about extensions. And this allows you to do just that. So we're actually viewing this project directly on GitHub, and we can open these files, and it looks like they're running locally. We get syntax highlighting and all that good stuff. We can even do things like preview markdown, which is really nice, but we're just looking at it on GitHub. Now, in the case of this project, there is a point at which we want to run this app. So to do that, if I was to open up a terminal, it would be my terminal on my machine, but I don't have any access to this project, so I can't run it. So in that point, I do need to clone it. So to do that, we can just click here in the left-hand corner and say continue working on. And then we'll just say clone the repository locally and pick a spot for it. That works. We'll just put it here. And now we're cloning. But again, we didn't have to go back to GitHub to do that. We can just continue on. And now we're actually working locally. So this screen you may have seen before, this is called Workspace Trust. If you use VS Code, it's a new feature. Basically what it does is it asks you to trust the folder because there's extensions and code that could be executed automatically when a folder loads, and we want you to be safe. And so this is a new feature. Once you say that, yes, you trust for this folder, it doesn't ask you again. So I'm going to say, yes, I do trust, because I trust you, Dan. You're a good guy, I think. All right, so we now have this thing cloned locally, and we can run it. So if we look at the README, there's some steps to do that. But my problem with this is that I feel like the one thing they didn't check into this repository is their whole development environment. And I wish that somebody would have done that so I don't have to follow any of these steps. It would just run. So let's do that. Let's check our entire development environment into GitHub. So to do that, we're going to use something called the remote containers extension. Lots of extensions in this presentation. Should have been called extensions, extensions, extensions. So the remote containers extension here is already installed. And what this does is it allows us to define an environment that will run inside of a Docker container. So how do we add a configuration for this project since I don't know that much about Docker? Well, you don't really have to. We come here and say, add development configuration files here, and then it's going to inspect my project and see that this is a node project and give me some options. So I'm just going to choose node because I don't need any of that other stuff, and I'll take the default. And when that happens, you'll see I get a pop-up that says, hey, you have a dev container configuration. Do you want to reopen this in a container? And I'm going to say, whoa, VS Code. It's not VS Code. It doesn't work that way. VS Code, hold your horses. Not yet. But we get a dev container folder, and in that, there's two files. One is a Docker file, which defines the image that's going to be used to run this project, or the Docker image, the container that will be spun up. And the other one defines some properties about that environment. And this is where we want to make some changes to automate all the steps that are in this README here. So for instance, like this section down here, let's go ahead and automate some of this away. So the first thing that it wants us to do is run npm install. So what we can do here is you can see that it's actually already there. We just need to uncomment this. We can do a yarn install. It's the same thing and will work just fine. It's a little faster. And then the other thing that the README wants us to do is it wants us to create an environment variable. We can actually do that too. So let's come here and we're going to use a property called container env. And then below that, we're just going to put the container env, and then the value is FRS. I believe, wasn't that the value? FRS. Okay. So at this point, I need to select rebuild and reopen in container. And then what's going to happen is Visual Studio Code is going to restart, but it's going to begin to build this dev container. You can see that here. If we want to, we can look at the logs. And if you're a Docker person, you might recognize some of what's going on here. I sure don't. But what's happening now is the container's up and running, and now it's executing yarn install. So it's installing all of the dependencies that this project needs to run. Okay, so the application's up, and we can add a note, include your whole dev environment. Fun. All right, awesome. So now what we want to do is we want to check our whole dev environment into GitHub. So how do we do that? Well, all we need to do is check in those files, and we'll include the yarn lock as well, which is not a problem. So let's go ahead and stage these changes. And then we'll just say, let's see, add whole dev environment. And we'll go ahead and commit them. You can see I'm doing this all from VS Code. I'm not actually going on the terminal at all to work with Git and GitHub. And then let's create a new branch. Again, I'm not going to the terminal. I don't even know how. And then we'll just do a new branch called the whole dev environment. You can see we're on that branch. You can see we're on that branch, and we have a little icon to push. So let's push. And you can see it knows that my origin, and in the upstream, it even knows where the fork is upstreamed from. So let's push to my origin. Push that branch up. Okay, so that branch has been pushed. And now I want to create a pull request. But again, I'm not going to go to GitHub to do that. I'm going to do it all from here. So from here, I can create a pull request. I'm just going to click on the pull request button here, and then go ahead, and it thinks that I want to probably do a PR to the upstream, which would normally be true, but I'm just going to do it to my own repo to the main branch. So from this branch to this branch, and then here, I put the whole dev env in the project. You're welcome. Okay, and then we're just going to create the pull request. All right, so our pull request has been created, and again, it opens right here. So if you haven't caught on yet, we're doing everything just right here without leaving, right in VS Code. And of course, I want a reviewer on this pull request. So let's go ahead and Brigit, would you be so kind as to review this pull request for me?
I would love to review your pull request, Burke. Thank you. All right, and then I'm going to hop over to your repo in the browser, And let's go over to the pull request tab. There it is. Okay. So normally when I get tagged in a pull request like this, I have a couple of options. So I'm taking a look at it. I put the whole dev environment in the project. You're welcome. Okay, cool. So typically I'll go over and see the files changed, and maybe I'll explore them by clicking and viewing the file or editing it. I could even open in desktop. But sometimes when I view the file here, I'd really prefer to take a look at it in VS Code because that's the environment I'm most familiar with. And taking a look at it in VS Code requires a context switch from the browser, or requires me to save it on my local machine or something like that. So really the quickest way I can think to do it is I actually have this cool trick where I can just hit the dot or the period key on my keyboard. So I'm going to do that now. And when I do that, GitHub's going to tell me it's setting up a web editor. And once this loads up, it's going to be what's known as the github.dev web editor. And what this is it's going to be VS Code running entirely in the browser. And it's going to be this lightweight instance of VS Code that's great for doing things like reviewing PRs and doing some lightweight code exploration and looking at new repos and things like that. So it's really awesome for instances like this where I get tagged in a pull request and I want to go ahead and take a look at the changes, and I want to get it in this familiar VS Code environment. So I'll close out of the terminal for now so I can get a little more real estate. And so I'm brought immediately into the pull request. So it saves a ton of time. And I can see in the status bar here, I'm on pull request number 1. So for instance, I could go ahead and start leaving some comments immediately. So I could say, I think checking in the environment makes a lot of sense. And I can start, I think this is a stroke of genius. So I could either start a whole review, or I could even just add a singular comment. So I'll add a singular comment. And taking a step back from adding some more information or adding some more comments, I want to take a look at what this web editor provides us. So if I go over here, we're going to see we have some of the same buttons that we have in desktop VS Code. So for instance, I'm going to have the files that were on my GitHub repo. So I could open up the README, for instance, and we're going to have different things, like we're going to have syntax highlighting and completions for different languages. If I go over here to the search, we're going to have multi-file search. So I could search for the word run, for instance, and it's going to give me results across multiple files because we can actually enable indexing. If I go over to the extensions view over here, I can install different extensions, and you can actually enable your extensions for the web. So for instance, I'd like to maybe go ahead and make my environment a little bit more exciting with a different theme. So let's go ahead, and one that I think is cool is Fairy Floss. So let's install that. And then once that installs, cool. So I have an even more exciting web editor experience. And then once I go ahead and maybe change my theme, install some more extensions, I could even go over to the gear and I could turn on settings sync. So that way I could sync this environment with my local VS Code instances, for example. And I could see I have some other options as well. So I could choose to switch between stable and insiders VS Code. So I have a ton of different options to get the latest features and fixes entirely in the browser. All right, so now that we've kind of seen some of the things that the web editor has to offer, let's go back to specifically some of the PR or the GitHub features. So if I go over here to GitHub, I can see that I can view the different pull requests that are open on the editor or on this repo, and I can view it in the editor. So for instance, I can see this PR that Burke had opened. I'll close out of this, and I could open up the description. And that description is going to be that same one that Burke saw in desktop VS Code. So I could add some other reviewers or some other assignees and labels. I can also see other issues that are open on the repo. If I wanted to, and I wanted to make other changes on this repo down the road, I could even go ahead and create new pull requests on this repo. I also think that it would be cool to potentially add some changes to this branch and directly to this pull request. So what I can do is I can go back to the README here, and I could go ahead and add some new content here and push it directly. So when I think about the change that Burke just made, he went ahead and added a dev container. And I think it would be really helpful to folks who are going to use this app to know about the dev container. So right now the README says how to run the app locally in a few different ways. So let's go ahead and add a new section to the README to talk about running in a dev container. So I'm going to add a section here that says running in a dev container. And I'd actually like to make sure that I'm getting my markdown syntax correct because, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky. So we can actually open the preview to the side. Cool, looks good. So I'm going to say 1, install the remote containers extension. And then I'll say, ensure you have the .dev container, because we want to make sure folks are on that branch or that it's been merged in. Reopen in dev container, and then magic happens. Kind of the basic premise of using a dev container I think will help folks get started. So I can go over the source control view. And now let's go ahead and commit this change. So I'll say update readme with dev container info. Now it says my changes are going to be committed directly to the branch that I'm working on. So when I go ahead and say commit, once it commits there, the change goes away, and I don't even need to push anything from the status bar. The change that I made to the README is automatically available on the repo already. So it was really smooth, direct integration into my GitHub repo. So now I'd actually like to try out that repo or that dev container that Burke added to our repo. But since this is a lightweight instance of VS Code running in the browser, it doesn't actually have backend compute. So if I go ahead and, for instance, open up a terminal, it lets me know that terminals aren't available in the web editor. So if I'd like to use a terminal, I need to go ahead and continue in another environment that can actually run code, like desktop VS Code or a GitHub Codespace. So there's a really smooth transition to doing that. So I can say continue working on, and I could either clone my repo locally, or instead what I'm going to do is create a new Codespace on this repo. So I'll click on this option. Now we're going to be brought into a Codespace in a new tab. And now Codespaces says that it's going to connect and set up a Codespace. It even says it's building a container. And that's because it's going to build a container based on that same dev container definition that was set up in the dev container JSON and the Docker file that Burke already created with the remote containers extension. And that's pretty convenient because that means that once we create one dev environment for our repo, it's going to work across all our different environments. So whether we're working in desktop VS Code or if we're working in Codespaces, we're going to be able to use that same configuration everywhere. So now that we're in a Codespace, we're going to see that it looks pretty similar to the web editor we were just in, but now it actually has a functional terminal. And so it's going to have some greater capabilities like having a terminal, having backing compute, because Codespaces are actually going to be backed by a virtual machine. You can have different virtual machine sizes depending on the needs of your application. It's going to have the full set of Visual Studio Code extensions that you can use. They don't need to be specially web enabled and things like that. And we can even see in our terminal, it's running that post create commands, that yarn install, to do some final setup to make sure that we have all of the tools and dependencies that we need to run our application. All right, so now our Codespace has been set up, our container was built, and our terminal is available and ready to run some commands in. So I'd like to go ahead and try out our app. So I'm just going to do an npm start because I think that's all we need to do. Let's go ahead and try it. npm start. Starting up our server and connecting to the forwarded port. So just like in desktop VS Code, Codespaces is going to take care of port forwarding for us and pop us over to a new tab where our app is going to be available. And let's see how it looks. Alrighty, and here we are. It's the same application that Burke was working on in desktop, and now in Codespaces in the browser. So I can go ahead and add a note. Let's say, hello from Codespaces. Awesome. And something cool to also note about Codespaces, even though I'm in the browser, there is a VS Code extension. So if you would prefer to work in desktop, you totally can. But we wanted to show that you can totally work in a VS Code environment without having to download or install anything locally at all. So here we are in our application. And if I go back over here, we can see we have a very similar ports view that we had in desktop that Burke had seen. And something else neat to know is that we have this privacy option for our port. And if I right click on it here, I could change port privacy. So I could even change it to public so that Burke and I could work on this app together. So you can see it, which is pretty cool. All right, and so that is a run through of our different options to write and run code anywhere. So I'll hop over to our last slide. So thank you so much for joining Burke and I to take a look at how to write anywhere and run anywhere. We got a look at GitHub repositories, remote containers and dev containers, the GitHub Dev Web Editor, and GitHub Codespaces. So really a full gamut of different Visual Studio Code experiences and using GitHub as well. We have a link here, aka.ms/write-anywhere, where you have some additional resources like some docs and some videos and even some opportunities on GitHub, for instance, to file some feature requests and issues. So we really love to hear your feedback too as you try out these different experiences. So please let us know what you think. And as always, happy coding.
Happy coding, y'all.